Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's Nutshell discussion. My name is Katie Adams, and I'm the Illinois Demonstration Farm Manager here at the Savannah Institute. The Savannah Institute is a nonprofit organization based out of Wisconsin and Illinois, focused on agroforestry research and education. We truly believe that widespread agroforestry can help restore soil, build resilience, and support strong economies of cooperation between farmers, researchers, and perennial industry builders. We host on-farm field days, offer print and online resources focused on key agroforestry practices, land access and lease structures, and the basics of establishing tree crops, which are all available for free on our website. We are also building a network of demonstration farms across central Illinois and southern Wisconsin so that we can learn from agroforestry in action. We are also currently hiring many positions and would love to have you join our team. So let me know if you have any questions about that tonight or by email. During this evening's discussion, if you're joining us from a computer, I want to invite all of you to share your questions and comments in the chat box here on the platform. We'll monitor them throughout the nutshell and make sure to address them during the Q&A session at the end. If you're joining us by phone, I'll give you instructions on how to ask a question after Matt's presentation. So now on to the main event. We are so honored to welcome back our presenter for the evening, Matt Wilson, who has taught me a ton through his work. Matt Wilson is a small farm production advisor with Grow Appalachia at Berea College. He is the lead author of Perennial Pathways, Planting Tree Crops, which is available through the Savannah Institute, and I will provide more information on that later. It's a phenomenal resource. He and his family own a small farm in Kentucky. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt to get things started. So give us 1 second while we switch presenters.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me back, Katie, and I'm excited to chat with everyone tonight. We're going to be talking about laying the groundwork for edible agroforestry planting with tree crops tonight. And so we're going to go into some details about integrating our goals as farmers and what the land can actually produce. So let's jump right in. Oh, I love this quote, "A goal without a plan is just a wish." So we're into long-term crops here, and we need to do long-term planning. So as Katie mentioned, we have this resource called Perennial Pathways, Planting Tree Crops, that's available through the Savannah Institute. I'm kind of following some of the outline that we put together in this book, so make sure you take advantage of this resource if you haven't already. It's free as a download from the Savannah Institute, or you can get a book copy too. Okay. So your approach to planning, again, we have these kind of two different major aspects that we're looking at. Our goals, what do we want to do? And the site evaluation, what's possible? What does the land support? Can you guys see that little pop-up that I'm seeing from Katie from the conference call? It's kind of in the way here.
Nope, I can't see it. I can just see your screen.
Okay, well then I won't worry about it. Right, so how do we put these two things together? Well, the answer is we need both, right? We need to know what we're capable of, what we want to do, but also what the land is capable of and what's the best fit for the land. So there are some frameworks that we can look at as we start to examine and evaluate what we want to do. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these, but there are good resources out there. So whole farm planning is one that takes into account farmers' goals and kind of all of the resources available. Holistic management is an excellent resource, especially if you're considering livestock. It was established, born out of primarily grazing systems, but now has expanded to encompass more than just livestock. Keyline design is another one that's looking at landscape, scale, management, and water movement and things like that. And then, of course, the permaculture movement has really great social integration with some of these kind of agricultural ideas. It's a bigger picture thing. So, I encourage everybody to take a look at these, see how they fit into what you're doing, and make them a part of your planning. So we have some different kind of goal-setting topics here, and we're going to go into each one of these. And the first one really is your quality of life. These are the big existential questions, right? What work do I enjoy doing? What makes me get out of bed in the morning? And some of this might seem like, okay, get to the real stuff, or we're talking about trees, man. But really, as farmers and as stewards of the land, we're not going to last very long if we haven't thought through what this stuff actually means for our life. And, I work with farmers every day as a small farm advisor, and I cannot stress enough the importance of thinking through some of this stuff, because this is what's going to allow us to stay in it for the long haul. How will this affect my family or my community? What does your spouse or partner or kids think about what you want to do? Have you talked about it? Have you talked about the long-term implications? How does what I want to do fit into my community? Do I have people that support me? Who can I get involved? How can I make this a resource for my community? Can I physically do the work? I've got a bad back. I don't want to be bending over harvesting vegetables all day, so I'm not a vegetable farmer. I don't mind reaching up to pick fruit, though. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe you want to be an organic farmer, but you can't run a weed eater to take care of the weeds, or whatever it is. If you have big plans for doing a bunch of tree thinning, are you comfortable running a chainsaw? Those kinds of things. And then just looking at what do you want your life to look like in 5, 10, 20, 30 years? What is it that you're doing day to day? There's another quote that's how we spend our days is how we spend our lives, right? And so, if you look at what it's going to take for you to establish trees on your farm or to do this work, is that really what you want to be doing? This was a shot on my farm this fall. We had a sorghum stir-off, and it was really a cool community event. And, this is part of that kind of quality of life thing. It was a heck of a lot of work, but it was really fun to get everybody together and get the kids involved and bring back some of these agricultural traditions. Okay, so this is really where the rubber hits the road when we're talking about goals, is income. Do you need to make money at this? And if so, how much? Is this a hobby for you? If so, is it like other hobbies where you can spend money, where you can lose money? Do you need to make a part-time income? Do you need to make a full-time income? I think, as you're looking at this stuff, you really need to ask yourself, will the land base support the income you need? And so we'll get kind of on the flip side where we're talking about what is suitable to the land. But if you say, I want this to be my full-time income in 10 years when my trees are mature, well, do you have enough acreage to actually support a full-time income? You need to look at that. And do the math. There's no easy answers here. You just gotta put the pencil to paper, or put your butt in the office chair, or whatever you need to do to figure these numbers out. If this is something that that needs to be generating income. I cannot stress enough that financial planning is really critical for long-term success. I was at the Southern Sustainable Agriculture Working Group Conference in Little Rock last week, and the keynote speaker had a quote that stayed with me. She was talking about climate change, but also the sustainability of farming financially. And she said, if it's not sustainable for the farmer, it's not sustainable for the farm. And, you know, an unprofitable farm in the long run is an unsustainable farm. So keep that in mind. So what this usually looks like is enterprise budgeting. And we're not going to get into the details of finances tonight, but you know, you can find budgets for the crops that we work with. There is some ongoing work on trying to do financial planning with these crops combined. I think the fruit and nut compass was one that was being worked on, and I'm not sure what the status of that tool is, but you can find, you know, budgets for apples or chestnuts or elderberries, and individually fill in your own numbers and then put them all together for kind of a whole farm snapshot. So there are resources for this. The Savannah Institute's working on some of this. Your extension office, depending on what state you're in, can have good economics or production data. I really recommend, and I'm biased, but the University of Kentucky's Center for Crop Diversification is really excellent, and it has a lot of very detailed crop and financial information for some of these tree crops that we work with. Another great resource is a book called The Organic Farmer's Business Handbook. There's a little typo there, by Richard Wiswall. And it's focused on vegetables, but it's really down to earth, and it'll tell you, you know, kind of how to put together a budget, how to keep your balance sheets, all that sort of stuff. All right, a big question is, when do you need a return on your investment? You know, these are kind of top-heavy systems where we're putting a lot of money down to plant things. When do you need that money back? Can you afford to put a bunch of money into something and not get a return for several years? Do you need a strategy for short-term income? You know, this is one of the kind of big questions is, what can we do in the meantime while our trees are growing? Can you do annual vegetables or crops, livestock? Maybe you have some timber that you could harvest, or firewood if you're, say, thinning a wood for silvopasture, or can you get on the Airbnb thing and start doing agritourism? Nursery stock, you know, as we expand agroforestry, there's going to be a need for planting stock. And you know, nursery crops tend to be pretty profitable. An example on our farm that we've been playing with these last 2 years, we had a SARE grant to see what, if we could use sweet sorghum and pastured poultry as a way to kind of cash flow the establishment of an organic orchard. So this is sorghum here, and to the left you can see the chicken pens. We were running these in between our rows of trees. And don't quit your day job. You know, there's nothing wrong with off-farm income. And the fact of the matter is, most farmers, and that's across the board, whether you're a livestock farmer, grain, vegetable, you know, most farms have somebody that's either part-time or doing an off-farm job. So the final thing here is there are a lot of grants and loans and other sources of income that you can look into. And again, I encourage you to look in some of the other resources here. We're not going to dive into it too deep, but the Natural Resources Conservation Service has some great grants and loan programs. Often individual states have funding for things, so make sure that you're talking to your extension agents, your local, you know, farm advocacy groups, and connecting with some of those sources of money that can help you get started. You know, and some people think, well, I don't want to take money from, you know, government or whoever. I mean, the fact of the matter, folks, is we're working with a stacked deck already. You know, small farmers and tree farmers are not what most of the focus is. So I tell people not to not to feel bad about trying to find sources of support for starting these things. So again, for establishment, most of these costs are up front. We've got to pay for the plants. We've got to pay for, tree protection from deer, weed control. Do you actually have the money to install it is a big question. You want to pencil this stuff out and see, if you've got the capital. One way you might be able to make it a little less costly is to propagate your own. So if you learn how to graft, or some things like elderberries or willow, currants, they can be propagated with cuttings. You're going to save some time if you buy already grafted trees or already rooted cuttings. But you may be able to save some money if you learn how to do some of this and you're not in a hurry. Right. Marketing is another piece of the puzzle. Do you like people? Are you willing to sit at a farmer's market booth and interact with folks? Do you have a market to sell to that's nearby? Are you willing to manage a CSA or a farm stand? Do you want to open your farm up to customers for U-Pick? Some of the most successful folks are doing U-Pick for things like chestnuts. My farm is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's not terribly accessible, fairly steep hills. There isn't much parking. So these are things that you have to think through in the context of your situation, your local markets, and your particular farm. On the scale that we're hoping to increase to, wholesale is probably where things are going to be going. So selling to grocery stores, to processors, especially if you're planning on doing machine harvest, this isn't going to be a direct consumer thing. You're going to have to make connections with businesses and folks that can use your product. Labor is another big piece of the puzzle. Do you want to be able to do all of the work on your farm? If so, you're probably going to want to spread your crops out so that your labor is spread out. Harvest is usually the pinch point here, right? So you may be able to take care of several acres of a tree planting, but when it comes to harvest and you've only got a 2-week window, there are only so many hours of daylight that you yourself can do the work. So are you comfortable hiring people? Is there labor available? Do you have family that are willing to help? Are there high schoolers that you can hire? Youth groups are one way that folks have, you hire a youth group for a day to come pick up nuts, and they earn money for their youth group. I know that there are several chestnut growers that hire Amish folks to come during harvest season. And maybe looking at the immigrant visas, the H-2A, if you can meet the requirements for that, and maybe a lot of times folks that are farmers that are using this program partner with other farmers to be able to provide enough work. So thinking through how you're going to meet the labor needs of your farm is pretty important. Here's a chart that we came up with. It's just an example, and you can make your own. This was just done in Excel of harvest windows, right? So if you can put in crops where the harvest window is spread out, that allows you or whoever to have a more spread out labor need. The information for this came out of local extension publications, and so doing an exercise like this, looking over here, saying, okay, well, if I plan on harvesting black currants by hand, which I don't really recommend anybody do, but if you decided to, you can see that I can really only handle, 2/10 of an acre here by myself, but if I come down to chestnuts here, I maybe can handle 2.5 acres by myself. So these kind of estimates, even if you're hiring labor, you can see, okay, well, during harvest time, I'm going to need, so many people to do such and such. Here's another chart that, again, is in Excel, and this looks really busy. But it essentially is the same kind of idea. I can put, and I just made this. This is a graph up here, and I can put in however many labor hours a farmer might have across the season, and then plug in whatever enterprise they're looking at, and how many hours those enterprises will take over the different weeks. And then I get a chart here that shows me this blue line is my baseline of 12 hours a week. And anything over this, I'm going to need to hire labor. And so, it's kind of a rough and tumble way of just saying what parts of the season you might have to maybe cut back if you want to keep it manageable for yourself, or hire labor. Another question is, what kind of inputs are you comfortable with? Are you willing to use herbicides or fungicides and fertilizer? There are, establishment considerations for this. So if you can use an herbicide to control weeds, for example, or, are you considering certifications like being certified organic or non-GMO, animal welfare approved, grass-fed? These are all kinds of really value-added certifications that you can look at. And a lot of this just has to do with personal preference. But it is going to have an impact on what trees you're able to successfully grow. I wouldn't recommend certain trees if people are planning on being completely organic, whereas if they're willing to spray maybe some fungicides, for example, they might be more possible. So this, again, depends on your personal preferences, depends on your market, whether or not you can get a premium for having these certifications, and whether or not there's demand for it. Equipment. So do you have access to equipment? Do you own a tractor? Are you willing to? Does your neighbor have one? This is a walk-behind tractor. I really like it. I hate working on tractors, and this thing I can pull apart and throw up on the bench in a workshop in the middle of the winter. It is not suitable for large-scale cropping. So thinking about, am I comfortable driving a tractor or some kind of harvester or mower? Can I hire somebody to do it? Do I have a place to put this stuff? Do you have a barn or a shed? Infrastructure is another piece of the puzzle. We talked about equipment storage. Do you have a place to process what you're going to harvest? A washing pack station. Do you have cold storage? Many of the fruits that we work with need to either be kept cold or be processed quickly. Do you have water available? And if you are processing fruits, it's going to have to be potable water, right? Do you have water for irrigation? Do you have road access? Is there a turnaround? If you're growing, bins and bins of apples, is there a way for a truck to come pick them up? Can you operate a forklift for pallets, that sort of thing? Okay. So that's the kind of the first part where we were talking about, and I sort of blew through all that really quickly, but again, it's important to take consideration of what you really want to do and those long-term, and those goals can change. You realize, oh man, I really hate shearing sheep, right? So I'm going to have hair sheep from now on. Or I'm afraid of ladders. I realize I don't want to stand on ladders. Whatever whatever it is. Things can change, but trying to get as clear a picture of what you want from the very start is important. So now we're going to flip and start talking about the site assessment. So matching the site conditions with whatever you're interested in growing. And the idea here is that the better suited whatever your crop is to the land, it's going to be less work, it's going to thrive better, it's going to be higher yielding, probably less disease pressure, insect pressure perhaps. So we really want to try to match our tree crops with the land. And we have two ways that we kind of do this. One of them is we can gather external information like soil maps, climate data, things we can look up online or ask somebody about. So we're going to talk about those first. Soil maps are really an important starting point. So this is Soil Web, which I really is probably the easiest way to get at a soil map. And yeah, so you can type in this address down here, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It will pop up, basically, as you click on the map, what the soil type is where you click. There's actually an app for this, too. So, you know, it'll tell you essentially where you're standing, what the soil type is. It's really cool. This is all, for you soil nerds out there, it's all Surgo data, so it's the same data set as Web Soil Survey, and it can tell you some really important information. So Web Soil Survey is kind of the more traditional NRCS website where we can access soil maps and soil data. It's a powerful tool. It's a little less intuitive than Soil Web, but it does allow you to print out soil maps a little easier. And what we're looking here is soil type, so you know kind of the class, the farmland class. So this will tell you, you know, things like, you know, all soil is prime farmland, or, you know, prime farmland if drained, or prime farmland if protected from flooding, things like that. So flooding frequency is important. You know, you can have well-drained soils that flood. I've got some of these on my farm, so they don't stay wet, but you know, for 2 or 3 days a year, they're underwater. Drainage is another big part of this. So soil drainage is going to be really important. We'll talk more about that. And then depth to restrictive layers like fragipans or water table, bedrock, that sort of thing. So once you have a soil map, then you can use things like Google Earth to give it some context. So we did a video about this. It was, and Savannah Institute has a couple of videos online on how to use some of these soil map resources, how to use Google Earth, how to use SketchUp. So you can check those out. This is a Google Earth map of my farm, and I have made polygons for each kind of parts of the field that are different from each other, right? You want kind of a homogeneous unit to be able to manage. So here in Kentucky, we have really variable soils. So this is a very variable map. So you can do simple things like outlining where your fence is. You can get into more detail where you can figure out your acreage. And then SketchUp is another tool that's freely available now. It's the online version is free. I think the standalone version is you have to pay for now. But this gets us to being able to draw scale maps. So we're not going to talk about that today, but that's another tool as we're thinking about how to lay these things out. So climate is obviously something we can look up for our area. The rainfall is going to be important. I think most folks here in the eastern part of the country. I don't have to worry too much about that. I'm from New Mexico originally, and you know, this whole water falling out of the sky thing's really cool out here. I like it. Makes it a lot easier to farm. So figuring out your rainfall is going to be important to match to your trees. Your plant hardiness zone is another one to look at, and that's what this map of the USDA map here is. You know, these are fluid, and we've been getting some crazy weather lately. So, you know, I would say plan a zone on either side, although things tend to move south easier than they move north, right? The cold hardiness is a big part of choosing trees. Yeah, I'm in central Kentucky, so Chinese chestnuts would be no problem here. If I was in, you know, northern Minnesota, I might have to be more careful about the kinds of trees that I select because it gets much colder. And then some microclimates like frost pockets and winds. So you ideally want trees that are sensitive to frost, so things are going to bloom early, essentially, out of frost pockets, because on a cold, clear, still night, cold air is going to drain and pool in the lower areas, and you also want to avoid ridge tops that are really windy for things that are susceptible to that. So kind of halfway up the hill tends to be ideal for our more sensitive crops. Things that bloom early here in Kentucky, we can only grow peaches, for example, in really select spots because most years they bloom too early. It warms up, they bloom, and then we get a late frost. So those are kind of the things that you can look at, you know, from external resources or online or whatever. And you're going to want to do a site visit if you're not familiar. I mean, most of us, you know, are working on a farm we're familiar with, but this is the part where we get down and actually go to the land and observe and measure and do things like soil testing. So I highly recommend that everybody do soil testing before they put anything in the ground. A lot of times this is free through a local extension office, not always, but they can help you learn how to do it. It's going to give you really important information like the pH, which for a lot of tree crops is very important to adjust before you put trees in. pH is one of those things where, you know, we're putting lime on typically to bring it up. In most of the eastern United States, the pH is lower than ideal. It's not often higher. And so when you put lime on, if you just spread it on the surface, it may take months or years for that lime to leach down into the root zone, or it may never leach down into the root zone of the tree. So it's much easier to adjust that, work it into the soil, and then plant our trees. Drainage is a really, really big piece of the picture here, guys. So, you know, if you have soils that stay wet, that is going to limit the types of trees that you can put there. And you're going to want to know that before you spend a bunch of money and time putting them in. So again, you can look at some of this on a soil map, but to really get a good idea, go to the site and observe. Dig a big hole, you know, 3-4 feet deep, and see what happens at different times of the year. If it stays dry for most of or doesn't fill up, you know, to the root zone of your trees for most of the year, you're probably okay. If you are, you know, tripping over crawdad holes, you probably have a high water table. And yeah, so things like, say you do have really clay, wet soils, you're not going to want to put chestnuts there because they're not going to do well. But something like hazelnuts might be okay. Or, you know, if you have a marginal site pears might be a better choice than apples, those kinds of choices. And so drainage is a big one. And then flooding. Like I said, I've got a field on my farm that is great soil, stays well drained most of the year, but in the winter, usually once or twice, it'll flood for a day. So I'm not going to kill any trees by doing that. The roots don't stay underwater, but it also washes a bunch of junk up into the planting. So what can I do? Maybe, well, what I did was I planted a willow brake there, so it catches any trash coming out of the, any logs or leaves or whatever. And willow don't mind wet feet. So we actually do have a site evaluation sheet in the tree crops book, and you can print these off, and when you go to the field and fill them out with all of these field characteristics. So we're looking at topography too, things like aspect. So this is kind of what direction the slope faces, right? So if you have a southern facing slope, it's going to warm up, it's going to be drier. We actually tend not to recommend sensitive fruit trees, at least on a south-facing slope, because in that early spring they warm up quicker and they come out of dormancy earlier, and then they have a chance for those late frosts to hit them. So if you have something, say like in the prunus family, maybe cherries or apricots or something that's going to bloom really early, consider putting it on the north side or the northeast side, because it's gonna wake up later in the spring, right? Something like, I don't know, mulberries would be real happy on a south-facing slope, or chestnuts. They like the heat. They're not going to be as bothered by that. So I talked about slope. That's just the percent incline of your field, and this is going to be an important one as you're thinking about machine harvest, or if you want to do any kind of tillage for soil preparation. If you have any slope at all, you really shouldn't be digging up your pasture or your hills, because it's going to wash away, it's going to erode, and we don't want to lose that soil. So the manageability of your crops, it's not to say that you can't plant trees on a slope. They'll do great, and some harvest machines can handle a slight slope. You can measure slope actually with apps on your phone, like the inclinometer. I think Apple's got it installed, but if not, they're free apps, and it's an easy thing to figure out. I wouldn't trust your soil map for slope. They're going to give you a range like 25 to 50%. Well, that doesn't tell you anything for that particular field, so it's a good thing to measure and note. Any erosion that's present is going to tell you a lot about, especially the previous history, cropping history, and where you may need to pay some attention to repair lost soils. And existing vegetation. We have wild elderberry down near our creek on my farm, and so I planted more elderberry there, and it's done well. This isn't always a good indication that what's there is going to continue to do well, and there's some disease issues to consider. Some things can harbor pests or diseases, but what's there? What's doing well? What don't you see? And then, of course, what weeds are there? Mainly, we're looking for the perennial culprits here. This is Canada thistle. You're going to want to probably spend some effort to eradicate or at least knock back some of these pernicious perennial weeds before you rely on something like mulch. You put down a say, wood chip mulch and Canada thistle or Johnson grass or bindweed. They're just going to punch right up through it. So knowing what weeds are there or learning what weeds are there is time well spent. So we take this information, we have our goals, we know what our site looks like, maybe we've made some maps in Google Earth, and we've spent some time evaluating. That's not something I had a slide of, but taking a year or 2 years to get to know a property is really a good idea because, well, for one, there's no normal anymore. I don't know about where y'all are, but here in Kentucky, we had 2 of the craziest years that we've ever had. We got almost twice as much rain in 2018 as normal. And then last year, it was a really wet spring. And then we had the hottest September on record. On my farm, we had 6 weeks with no measurable rain in September, and temperatures were over 90 degrees for 20 plus days. So, you can, the longer you spend, you get that kind of bigger picture idea of what your land does. Walk around in a rainstorm. Get out there with a raincoat. See where the water goes. See what happens in winter. See where the dry spots are in summer. Spend some time getting to know your land, and again, it'll be time well spent. So we have this information now, and then we can get to do our shopping, right? So we've got our goals, we've got our site figured out. Now we can look at the tree crop species that might be suitable, trees or bushes or forages or whatever, livestock, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle. And this is the fun part, because you can look and say, okay, I've got this spot that, might be a little wetter. Here's this crop that would work for that here. This one's up on a hill, maybe something that can handle a little more wind up here. Or, we're only going to have to check on this once a year, twice a year. Maybe I'm going to put it in a less easily accessible spot. Or I plan on having you pick here, so it should be up front by the road. This is where the kind of rubber hits the road, and you get to be the architect of your farm plan. So we have profiles in the Perennial Pathways Planting Tree Crops book. Savannah Institute has recently come out with these kind of short worksheets on key perennial crops. Again, look at your extension, talk to people in your area that have grown these things. The local knowledge base is always going to be a really good resource. And so what you end up with, hopefully, is a map where you've figured out where things are going to go and how many acres of each. And, none of this is a kind of a linear process, right? You're going to go back and forth. Think, oh, well, I thought I was going to put chestnuts there, but then this spring I went out there and dug a hole, and it looked like I could make pots out of the clay that was there, so maybe I should put them somewhere else. Or, I was going to do an acre of honey locust here and realized I need to make more money than honey locust can provide, so I'm going to pick a different crop that makes more money per acre, something like that. So fine tune as you go, and have fun. If we're not having fun, then we should probably be doing something else. So. And this is my farm in fall. That same project with the sorghum and cover cropping. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Matt. I loved how you balanced the goal setting and kind of the long-term planning with how you approach it on the landscape.
Yeah.
I, as someone who's currently planning farms for the Savannah Institute, as well as my own personal projects. I'm definitely going to take those questions and help that shape what we're doing. So Morgan has a question. Is there any information on average cost per acre for establishment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is it's out there. And again, you're probably going to have to look to your extension publications for the most part. So this would be looking at an enterprise budget, say for whatever crop you want to do. It gets a little tricky on a cost per acre when we're mixing things, right? So it's going to be important to understand what the assumptions are of any economic information that you find. So most of the enterprise budgets are going to be for monoculture, right? If you look up an apple orchard budget, it's going to be just apples in that orchard. And, well, what do I do if I planted apples and pears? So you got to look at the individual costs maybe for the trees, adjust the density a bit, and, do your best to figure out what it means when these are perhaps integrated with different crops. Does that answer your question?
A follow-up question from Morgan. Morgan says yes, that does answer her question. And another question, do you companion plant or use polycultures?
Yeah, I do. And I recommend everybody implement diversity, right? Having multiple types of crops are good for the biology, the diversity, the stability of the system as a whole. So we have good evidence that the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is. The big question is, how much do we have to integrate? Is it okay if I have a row of apples next to a row of pears? Or do I have to go apple, pear? Or, do I do apple, plum, pear, honey locust? What level of integration and diversity do we need? And I don't know that anybody has good answers for that. I think there are folks working on it. And but I would say at this point, consider how those crops are going to be managed and use that as the baseline for how you arrange things. So, one resource I can think of that is doing companion planting and has put some information out there is the Miracle Orchard. He's out of Canada, and there's actually a short video, and he's got a website now. Stefan, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I can probably look it up, but it's worthwhile to take a look at what he's doing because it's pretty cool. But yeah, the short answer is yes, and I recommend it. The long answer is it gets complicated, and we don't really know how best to arrange things.
Matt, I wonder if you might share a little bit about what's going on in this photo here, because you've shown two photos of the tree tubes and the mulching there.
This one here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was actually my graduate field work at the University of Illinois. I studied using cover crops for organic tree establishment. So we grew rye as a cover crop, planted in the fall before we planned on planting trees, and then we planted our trees in the spring and cut and raked them. The rye essentially is a straw mulch. So one of the big questions we were trying to figure out is, how do we get enough mulching material where it isn't available? Wood chips are awesome. I can't get the tree guys to come out to I can't pay them to come to my farm and drop wood chips. In some places that's not a problem, but So we were looking at growing your own mulch essentially, and it worked great. Actually, if, I could probably pull up a slide if somebody's interested in that. But essentially, we compared wood chips and rye to mowing and no weed control. And I'll tell you that mowing and just the weeds were exactly the same. There was no difference between it. So mowing did not adequately control competition. Wood chips beat out, and the trees with the wood chips grew twice as much, essentially, twice as tall and twice as wide on the trunk in one season as those that didn't have a mulch. So I do recommend mulching if you can do it. Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing. I know it was a little off topic, but it's something that I've been learning more about. I know you're an expert on that.
Yeah, and actually, I've got, let's see, I can maybe pull it up here. There's a little section in the Perennial Pathways book on, here it is, on it. It's got a little bit more detail, but I'm happy to share more info with anybody that wants it too.
Ask a question. Oh, we have a question from Hannah.
Yeah. So have you had any surprising failures?
Have you had any surprising failures? Anything you felt confident?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, all the time. Let's see. Well, so I can talk a little bit about this same study, SARE grant that I did. One of the elements of using the pastured poultry was trying to grow cover crops as a way to lower the feed bill for the chickens. So we grew a mix of, wheat and barley and Austrian winter pea and triticale and all kinds of things. And then I went ahead and chopped them, grew them until they were mature in June, timed a batch of broilers to roll in right before. So the grain was mature, went out there with a scythe, cut it down, put the electric fence over it, put the birds in. They were grazing it. They were picking the grains off. I was thinking, this is great. Like, my feed bill is going to go down. We're getting the cover crop, weed control. We're getting the manure from the chickens. When I crunched the numbers on weight gain, the feed conversion, there was no difference. I didn't save any money on feed, right? So that was a disappointment, but our soil quality went up. In one season, we gained a percentage point of organic matter, which is pretty phenomenal. The chickens did great. They were healthy. We didn't lose any to predators. Yeah, so we'll see about the cover crop mulch. One of the big questions, and we're testing it now, is are voles going to be a problem? They tend not to be a problem in wood chips because they don't like it, but they love straw. And they can hide, and the coyotes and the hawks and everybody can't get them. So, I might walk out to all half-girdled trees in the spring. I put the tubes on, and I've got hardware cloth at the bases of some of them. One thing that so I guess this is something we learned at the University of Illinois as well. The tree tubes make a really nice environment for rodents, and there were times when we went out to some of the study plots and lifted up a tree tube and 200 hazelnuts fell out because the mice had used it for their storage, and the tree was completely girdled. It's like a little, sauna in there. So if you can lift your tree tubes up, and I'm trying this idea. I put about a 6-inch wire section underneath my tree tubes. So it's still protected from deer, but it's drafty. I'm hoping that the mice and the voles don't like that. Yeah.
That's
So
a great idea for tree tubes.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Can't hurt, I don't think. So, Sam says, you mentioned the erosion dangers of establishment on steep or steeper slopes. How do you recommend establishing on these slopes without an initial tillage pass? Individual prep per planting hole? That is a great question, Sam, and it's one that I have asked myself a lot. And at this point, I don't have a lot of experience to speak from, so you can take all this with a grain of salt, and everything I say for that matter. What I'm looking at right now actually is using landscape fabric. So I'm not crazy about plastic for a lot of reasons, but a lot of my whole farm is essentially is pretty steep, and so I think you could get away with individual prep per planting hole. If you've got a 30 by 30 foot spacing and all you're prepping is a 4 by 4 foot hole for each tree, your erosion's going to be minimal. But what I've been thinking about is pinning down like a 4 by 4 foot piece of landscape fabric. Pin it down with sod staples, and either plant the tree and use landscape fabric, or if you don't want to use landscape fabric when the tree is there, maybe pinning it down the year ahead so that it kills the sod, and then coming in and either mulching with something or establishing a less competitive ground cover. But there are differing opinions on landscape fabric. Some people don't like it while their trees are in the ground because again, the rodents they've got little rodent highways under there. They've got free reign. Some people swear by it. So I would say, I personally, in my experience, I don't like putting landscape fabric down and then covering it with wood chips, because at least the grasses and the weeds where I am send out runners, and it'll invade that mulch pretty quick, and then you have a nightmare because it'll put roots down through that landscape fabric, and it's really hard to deal with at that point. But great question, Sam. I'd love to hear what other people are doing.
This past year, I also started experimenting with landscape fabric around the base of trees, and we've had pretty good success with it on a small scale.
Yeah.
The hard part is sourcing that many staples and pounding that many staples.
Right.
But the weed suppression has been really fantastic when we weren't able to get wood chips dropped at one of the farms that I was managing. So we'll see after this winter and how it holds up and how things go next spring. But doing those squares of landscape fabric have been great.
Yeah. Yeah, Johnny's has got a staple driver that allows you to stand up while you're driving staples. I'm looking for it, but it's basically a stick with like a magnet slot on the end, and you just stick your staple on and poke it down in the ground. Works pretty well.
One last question that I have is, you threw up that really wonderful seasonal labor spreadsheet. Is that something that's a Matt Wilson creation, or is it something that you pulled from an open source somewhere?
Yeah, that's a Matt Wilson creation, but I'm happy to share it with anybody. Again, it's a work in progress, and I wouldn't recommend relying on anybody's Excel unless you're slightly familiar with the program yourself, because things can get wonky real quick. But if anybody wants to, wants it, I'm happy to email it to them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Sure.
Well, if no one has any further questions, I'd really like to thank you, Matt, for joining us and providing us some really good gristle to chew on as we pursue our farm and agroforestry dreams. And if you wouldn't mind sharing it, I can also send it to folks that joined us on the webinar tonight, your presentation.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
once again, thank you, everyone who joined us. Thank you, Matt, for sharing your wisdom and your work. And we hope that you'll join us for future webinars here this season and beyond.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Have a great night.
You too.